very awesome. Yeah, we had a little restart this morning, and but this is Sean from. We're going to talk about does our subconscious mind actually influence our daily life? Now, before we actually really can answer that question, it was a question from one of my listeners. We have to actually understand: do we actually have a subconscious mind? Now, here's the thing, right? If you ask this to a scientist, then a scientist would always say, if I cannot prove a thing, it doesn't exist, right? If I cannot prove a thing, it doesn't exist. So there is of course that's a really good thing, and that's why science progresses so well because we stick to those rules, right? We prove it, and we do it again, and we can prove it, and we can do it again. So in to a large extent, I love science, but there is actually something missing in that definition. If I cannot prove it, then it doesn't exist. Because if you go years and years back, there were a lot of things that we were not able to prove, and hence they didn't exist, but they did exist. So very simple example, there was a time that there were scientists that were just not advanced as they are now, and they had the same logic as they have now, but they were just not so advanced. So, for instance, we believed that the earth was flat. We couldn't prove that it was not flat, and therefore the earth was flat, right? So, but we actually could also not prove that the earth was flat. We just believed that the earth was flat. That makes sense. We couldn't prove either, but since the common belief that was that the earth was flat, so scientists say, hey, we cannot disprove that the earth was flat. So some of them said, then we don't know, but most of the people then accepted, okay, the earth must be flat. Does that make sense? So that's kind of a thinking trap that still exists. And it's always a little bit challenging for science. Scientists knows that this thinking trap could exist. So if you go into modern psychology, then and we talk about the subconscious mind, then actually we are not able to prove it according to to a scientific kind of way. Now there is one. It's just not too long ago, about 200 years ago. There was a guy called Sigmund Freud. You might have heard of him, and he talked about ID. Some people say ID or the it. He talked about the superego and the ego, and and his philosophy is actually that it or the ID is that you write it as ID as two letters. He was saying that is your basic, primal instinct. You can't help it. That's how we are built, and we are. Freud believed in evolution, so he was coming. He said that it's a primal instinct, and therefore, and so we can't help that we react in a certain way. But we have something that is trying to battle that because we became human beings, and we call that the superego. And he's trying to have that's kind of your internal norm and values, your inner compass. Which sounds like that sounds like a kind of a thing. And still, people follow actually that philosophy. He never could prove it. He just had a lot of test objects where he could see this kind of behavior. And then he said your ego is constantly kind of negotiating between the it and and your superego. So your the things of shall I flight or fight. That is kind of the battle. What the ego does say is this like should it, your it says you need to run away, but your superego is like hey the best thing to do here is actually to help that person, and so your ego is doing that battle for you. He's making that decision. That's a little bit what it is, and all that happens kind of in your subconscious. Does that make sense? That was the Freudian way of looking at things. Yeah, it's kind of a little bit of scientific um, episode here today. I hope you think it's still interesting. But in the philosophies way before that, there was already talked about a sort of subconscious, but it talked about a subconscious that you can't do anything about it. That's just this. There's a little someone else in you, a little man or a little woman is in you, and there is nothing you can do about it, and it actually derails everything you do. And so that's called the homunculus. And so they battle with you, and that actually doesn't sound so weird at all if you follow some of the coaching that I do. It seems that there is always something in you that kind of either derails you or makes you do something much better than you actually intended to do on a conscious level. Yeah, does that make sense? But most psychologists say, I don't like the fact that you cannot do anything about it. And I totally agree with that. There is something in you that makes you do things, and you don't know why that is, right? So that is called the subconscious, right? So both theories are kind of pushed aside, and so we are now maybe thinking of what modern psychology is often called as automatic thinking. Automatic thinking. So, for instance, if you drive a car and you take the same route every day, then you go. You don't even know sometimes whether the traffic lights were red or green when you come to your destination, say your work. So that all happened kind of subconsciously. So automatic thinking. You drove the car so often that you don't have to consciously think about it every time when I'm doing this because I'm European, so I drive a shift, right? So you don't have to think about it the whole time. And that's probably a good thing. But if you are an open heart surgeon, then it might be a really good thing if you keep really good attention to all the things that you do. You don't want to do everything on automatic pilot there, right? So it requires a lot of your attention. I'm a dancer. A lot of the movements that we do are very complex. So we practice them so often so that we can push some of our movements into our subconscious, and that we can give more attention, and I'll come back to that word attention in a second, that we can give more attention to the things like maybe the performance of our facial expressions and how we look at the audience and stuff like that, right? Well, there's a downside of that, because if you practice not so well and your automatic behavior is not so wrong, then automatically, subconsciously, you constantly start to make the same mistakes. You might not even be aware of it. And when I see that a lot with my dance student, and by the way, I also see that with myself when I practice and I look it back on tape and I think, oh, gosh, I thought it was so much better. But actually, that means that in our practice, we actually were, and that was a conscious effort when we were practicing, but sometimes we don't practice conscious enough, and therefore when we push those movements into our subconscious, make them do automatic thinking, as a lot of psychologists call it nowadays, that actually becomes then something not of the quality that you want to receive. Now that could happen in all kind of situations. That happens also with driving a car. You could see that some people just automatically make the same mistake. So yes, automatic thinking does exist, right? Otherwise, you would be super tired if driving a car and everything has to happen on a super conscious level. Does that make sense? So that's one side of it. Now, we take that a little bit further, because our mind has only, let's say, a limited amount of capacity that we give attention to. You see that if I look here, because I have to manage something over there too, my attention literally goes from one screen to the other, right? It's now with you guys, now it's with the other screen. Now you guys don't see that I have attention here, you just know that I don't have attention with you. Does that make sense? Yeah? So we only have a limited amount of attention. So, and since our brain knows that, we push some of that attention that maybe is not super important, we push that to a subconscious level. There is that word again, right? So driving a car, if I drive a stick shift, I don't have to consciously look at the stick shift. In the beginning you need to do that. Yeah, you don't have to consciously look at the stick to go to the next gear, or to go, so you don't have to do that. You do that automatically. So It is actually more the amount of attention that we can have that defines how much we push in our subconscious. Yeah, does that make sense? So those two are very much related. Now, and last but not least, is this thing can be changed. So if you say, hey, every time when I see a dog and I want to run away, right? Go back to that example that I had of Freud. It seems like we can actually change that behavior. We can actually assess the situation, say, okay, this is not a dangerous dog, so I don't have to run away. So we can do something about it. Therefore, mindfulness is a form of meditation, mindfulness meditation that actually helps you to go a little bit more into your subconscious behavior and look at and make that a little bit more conscious than normal, and you can correct it. So go back to that dance example that I gave. So if you look back at your tape, or that could be in hindsight, you hear feedback from somewhere else, or maybe you give yourself feedback, then you can say, hey, I can change the things that I did unconscious. I make them subconscious. I make them a little bit more conscious, practice them again, and then I can let them go into my conscious level. Same thing when you drive a car. The first years you drive a car, you make maybe not so many mistakes, but you start to become more and more proficient because you upped your training. Now, one last thing before we close this off for today is let's come back to that awareness that I had, like the attention that you can have, which is only limited, right? And a really good proof of that is, when you drive a car, there are some things that you can do. Actually, thinking about how your day was, or thinking maybe what your next meeting is. To some extent, we can do that while driving a car, and it won't be actually very dangerous. We can actually listen to music and operate maybe even the radio a little bit. But once we go into operating the GPS, which is very close to driving a car, it becomes already a little bit dangerous. But once we start to operate our phone, we start to text, then our attention goes too much into the text, and that's actually when it can go really wrong. Now, this podcast is not about whether you should text or not text behind the wheel. Well, I think you shouldn't, although I sometimes do, I honestly admit. But those two things don't go together. You cannot do that, right? You cannot subconsciously make a text. So that requires too much. Now, maybe with a lot of practice, you can actually learn that. I do that, but the risk to practice that is too wide. You know that the causes of accident, the number of causes of accidents because of texting is the fastest reason why we get accidents at the moment. So don't do that. I'm just giving you this while I was talking about the subconscious mind. So yeah, how does our subconscious mind, or does our subconscious mind influence our daily lives? Actually, yes, of course. Without a subconscious mind, we would not be able to operate really well. It would be really hard to drive a car, about do everything, because a lot of the things that we do actually subconsciously, because they are routine, we are used to it. Can we influence them? Yeah, to a way larger extent actually than most people actually allow themselves. We have a coaching method. I teach the coaching method, what we call shadow and light. There are definitely things in you. Let's say I am I'm trying to meet a new girl, and it makes me always really nervous. And the moment you want to say something smart, you say something really dumb. Yeah, that happens, right? You say something really dumb, and then afterwards you say, oh, why did I say that, right? Same thing could happen in a job interview, right? Every situation where you've got a little bit nervous, you start to do things that it feels like you don't have them under your control, right? In a job interview, I interviewed many people in my career, and I had many people who said really crazy things, while they're in a job interview, and then after that they sometimes apologize, sometimes they were completely not aware of that they were saying that. So same thing, if I make the analogy here with dancing, same thing, you go to a competition, you practice really hard, but then suddenly you make mistakes that you never made before, so you don't even know where that's coming from. It's coming from your subconscious mind. I call that's coming from your shadow part. It's kind of the things that it's even a little bit deeper than your subconscious mind. But the same thing is here, the same philosophy, the same theory I have on the same thing. All these things can be influenced if we let them go to the light or to our conscious mind in a time where we can do that. Practice is the best time to bring the things that are derailing you, to bring that into what I call the light or into your conscious mind, so you can change that. So a lot of the things that we do, we think we can change, but actually you can change that. All right. So that was for Sean today at Instagram Live, and as always, also simultaneously at the podcast Thrive Not Survive After Child Abuse. I wish you an incredibly good weekend, of course, and a beautiful Sunday. The weather is nice outside here in Dallas, at least. It's getting a little bit